Have you ever felt like the whole debate about what's right and wrong just goes round and round and round? You know, like never really getting anywhere. What
Right.
if I told you there was this 18th century guy, a real sharp thinker, who had some ideas that still get philosophers talking today? Ideas that might just cut through some of that fog.
Yeah, that's a great question. Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going deep into the world of Richard Price. He was really a kind of Renaissance man of the Enlightenment, born way back in 1723, lived a pretty long life, died in 1791. And during that time, his mind, well, it just went everywhere. He was a minister.
A dissenting minister,
Yes,
yes.
a dissenting minister, but also a philosopher, a political thinker, a writer on ethics and politics. Oh, and theology too, of course. But then he also got into probability theory and even actuarial science. Like the guy worked on figuring out how long people were going to live. Pretty pioneering stuff for the time.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? And he wasn't just some ivory tower guy either. This was a guy who got involved, like really involved in politics,
Yeah.
campaigning for religious tolerance, fighting for people who didn't fit the mold. And he was a huge supporter of both the American and French revolutions.
Well, yeah, definitely a huge supporter. And that, as you might imagine, got him into some pretty heated debates,
Oh, yeah.
most famously with Edmund Burke.
Right, right.
But then you also have thinkers like Thomas Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft coming to his defense. So fireworks all around.
Yeah, absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're trying to get to the heart of Price's thinking, especially his ideas about morality. What did he believe, and why should we even care centuries later?
Oh.
Our guide for this journey, well, it's a very detailed entry in Richard Price from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yep, that's our roadmap.
So the entry gives us this really clear structure. First, we're going to see how Price went up against, challenge some of the big philosophical ideas of his time, and then we'll explore his own ideas about what morality really is and how we can even know if something is right or wrong. Where do we even begin with a mind like this? I mean, the guy did so much.
Well, I think a great place to start is by recognizing that Price was, at his core, a moral philosopher. And the entry actually calls him an ethical intuitionist, but in two different ways. And these two senses of being an intuitionist, well, they're really key to understanding what he was all about.
Okay, intuitionist. So the first meaning, according to the entry, is about how we gain knowledge, especially moral knowledge, the whole right and wrong thing. So Price wasn't a fan of the idea that all our knowledge just comes from our senses, right? Seeing, hearing, touching, all that.
Exactly. He was very much against that. Price really believed in what we call necessary truths. These are like fundamental principles, things that aren't learned through our senses. He thought we grasp them through reflection, through thinking things through. And he called this intuition.
Intuition. Okay, so when he said intuition, he didn't mean like a gut feeling or just a hunch.
No, not at all. He was very specific. For Price, these intuitions, well, they're these non-sensory states of awareness. So they're in your mind, but they're not coming from what you're seeing or hearing. They're conscious, definitely. They have specific content, but they're not about like a particular fact in the world. And they're not based on some prior justification. It's not like you need proof to have them. And here's the interesting part. They're not something you can choose to have or not have. It's like they're just there, compelling you. Like they just make sense. And for Price, these intuitions, well, they reveal the very essence of actions. And that essence is what tells you if an action is morally right or wrong, or maybe just, okay, neutral.
So it's not like you look at a bunch of people doing good things and bad things, and then you figure out some rule from that. It's more like you think deeply about it, and then bam, something just clicks in your mind, like a light bulb.
Exactly. It's about seeing what's essential, what makes something good or bad in itself. And Price takes this even further. He actually questions whether we even get basic concepts like right, wrong, good, purely from experience. He's like, look around. Do you actually experience pure goodness or pure wrongness?
Right, it's like you see someone being generous, but the idea of goodness is not just that action, it's like something bigger.
Yeah.
So how did he argue against this everything comes from experience idea?
Well, this is where he gets really clever. He comes up with this argument that's sometimes called the companions in guilt argument, which the entry talks about. And his point is basically this. If you're going to say we can't have these innate moral ideas because they don't come from experience, well, then you've got a problem. You've got to explain all sorts of other ideas we have that also don't seem to directly come from our senses. Like, how about solidity? How do you experience the concept of something being solid? Not just the feeling, but the idea itself. And what about substance, the idea that things have an underlying reality? Or power, the ability to cause change? Then you've got cause and effect, duration, inertia, infinity, the concept of number, identity, like what makes something the same thing over time. Oh, and equality. And then you've got all those abstract ideas like possibility and necessity.
Wow, that's a lot of companions. It's like he's saying, if you want to kick moral concepts out of the innate ideas club, you've got to kick all these other concepts out too. You can't pick and choose.
Precisely. And his point is that our understanding, the part of us that reasons, that's the source of these concepts. Moral ideas are in there too, not just things we pick up through our senses. And the Stanford entry points out, this puts those who believe that all knowledge comes from experience, it puts them in a tough spot. They've got to show how you can get these concepts from experience alone, or they've got to admit maybe we don't really understand these things clearly, or maybe our ideas about them are just confused.
It really challenges a lot of the philosophical thinking going on back then. Now, the second way that Price is called an intuitionist, it has to do with his belief in a variety of fundamental duties. So not just one big duty, but a whole bunch of them. What does that mean for how we should actually act morally?
Right, so this gets to how Price disagreed with the utilitarians, who basically said morality boils down to one thing: benevolence, do the most good for the most people, that's it. Price was like, nope, not so fast, it's more complicated than that.
Okay, so he's saying that it's not just about maximizing happiness or well-being for everyone equally?
Yeah, he had two main points. First, he said, well, we've got special duties to certain people, not just everyone equally. These are what he called positional duties. It's like you have a duty to God, a duty to yourself, and duties to people you have special relationships with, like your family. Second, he argued that some duties aren't just about being benevolent in different ways. He said things like gratitude, honesty, and justice. These are all distinct moral obligations. They stand on their own.
That makes sense. And I think it's really interesting how he says that our duty to God doesn't actually include benevolence. Why did he separate those?
Well, he basically said it doesn't make sense to think we can actually benefit God by what we do. Like, can you really make God happier?
Right. You can't really do God any favors, can you?
Nope. So benevolence, it means wanting what's good for someone, wanting to improve their well-being. Price just didn't think that applied to God.
Okay, that makes sense. Now with all these different duties that Price is talking about, what happens when they clash? Because, I mean, that happens in real life all the time. The entry mentions that he was aware of this problem.
Yeah, he was. Price acknowledged that in some situations, you might have different duties pulling you in different directions. Like, what if you need to lie to protect someone from harm? Or what if being just in one situation ends up hurting someone you care about? Price believed that sometimes one duty is just clearly more important, and it's obvious what to do. But he also admitted that sometimes it's really hard to know which duty should win out.
So even with these fundamental moral principles, figuring out the right thing to do, it's not always easy.
No, not always. But here's the key point that the Stanford entry emphasizes. Price believed that there's always one right answer in any situation, even if we don't know what it is. He's saying there is an objectively right thing to do. We might argue, we might be confused, but the answer is out there. He thought we'd disagree about morality because, well, we're limited, we don't see the whole picture. It's not that morality itself is fuzzy or unclear.
Okay, so there's a right answer, even if we're not always smart enough to know what it is. That's a big claim. That leads us into the whole area of moral knowledge, like how do we even know anything about morality and what is morality in the first place? The entry calls him a moral realist, so what does that mean?
Right. So moral realism for Price, it means he thought moral truths are real. They're out there. They don't depend on what we think or feel or what some king or government says. He totally rejected this idea called ethical voluntarism, which basically says morality depends on someone's will. Like it's either God's will or some human ruler's will. Price just didn't buy it. He also didn't think morality was all about self-interest, and he was a big critic of the sentimentalists, folks like Hutcheson and Hume.
Ah, the sentimentalists.
Yeah.
They're the ones who said morality comes more from feeling than reason. We're definitely going to have to talk about that whole debate. But before we do, the entry says Price basically came up with the open question argument before it was cool. Why is that important for moral philosophy?
The open question argument, well, it really throws a wrench into any attempt to define moral words using non-moral, like natural properties. This was later made famous by the philosopher G.E. Moore, but the entry points out that Price was really the first guy to get at the core of the argument. He basically set up this dilemma for anyone who wants to say a moral word, like right or wrong, is just another word for something like advantageous, or what God wants, or even what makes people happy.
Okay, so like if someone says good just means what brings pleasure. What's the open question there? What else can you ask?
Yeah, exactly. Price says, well, if good really just means what brings pleasure, then asking, is pleasure good?
Mm.
Would be a dumb question, right? It'd be like asking, is pleasure pleasure? But Price is like, come on, that's clearly a real question. We can all wonder if something pleasurable is actually good, morally good. And that gap between the definition and the concept, that's the problem. It means goodness can't just be boiled down to pleasure. And the same logic applies if you try to define right as what God commands or even what helps society.
That's really clever. He's saying moral concepts, they're not just about describing stuff in the world. They've got this extra something.
Exactly. They point to something deeper. Now, we should talk about this battle with sentimentalism that the entry highlights. What was the core of that disagreement?
Laid on me.
All right, so the big difference between the sentimentalists and rationalists like Price, well, it comes down to this. Where do our moral judgments come from? The sentimentalists, like Hutcheson and Hume, they argued that our moral distinctions, they come from feelings and emotions, our sentiments. Hume famously said, morality is more properly felt than judged of. They thought we're just naturally wired to feel approval for some actions and disapproval for others. That's the basis of morality for them. Reason, for them, it's more like a sidekick. It helps us figure out how to get what our feelings tell us we should go for.
So for them, it's like, I see someone doing something kind, and I feel good about it, so my brain says, yep, that's morally right.
Yeah, you could put it that way. It's all about the emotional response. And they argued that even though people might have some different reactions, there's enough common ground in our feelings to have some shared moral standards. But they did acknowledge that this agreement sort of depends on how we humans are built, emotionally speaking. You could imagine other beings with different emotions having totally different morals.
Right, like maybe aliens would have a whole different set of morals based on how they feel. Okay, so Price, as a rationalist, he had a totally different take on where morality comes from.
Oh yeah, completely different. Price and other rationalists like Cudworth and Clark, they believed that moral distinctions, they're actually perceived by reason. And reason, for them, is the boss. It tells us what our goals should be, even moral goals, and it tells us how to achieve those goals. So moral motivation, it's not some big mystery. For Price, it's like we're rational beings. If we see we have a good reason to do something, we're motivated to do it. And we have really good reasons to do what morality tells us to do.
So instead of, I feel good about this, so it must be right, it's more like, my reason tells me this is right, so that's why I want to do it.
You got it. That's a great way to put it. Now, the entry actually breaks down Price's critique of sentimentalism into two parts. First, his defensive moves, where he's basically arguing against their points, and then his offensive moves, where he directly attacks their core ideas. Let's start with the defense. How did Price respond to the sentimentalists?
Okay, well, the entry points out a few key things that Price was trying to address. First, how can reason, not just feelings, give us our basic moral concepts? Second, if reason is the key, how do we actually figure out what those moral qualities are and say true things about them? And third, what's the deal with feelings? Like, how do they fit in with our rational understanding of morality? And how does reason actually make us do stuff, morally speaking?
Great questions. Price basically argues that the sentimentalists have things backwards. They're saying, we feel approval for an action because we see it as right, but Price says, no, it's the other way around. We feel approval because we already recognize it as right. He even said, I cannot perceive an action to be right without approving it. He thought there's this necessary connection between seeing something as right and then feeling good about it or approving of it.
So feeling good, it's a result of recognizing something is right, not the other way around.
Exactly. And Price goes on to argue for what's called motivational internalism about obligation. This is a fancy way of saying that just recognizing that something is morally required, well, that inherently gives you a reason to do it. It's built in. And the same goes for things that are forbidden. If you see it as wrong, that gives you a reason not to do it. He also thought recognizing something as morally good or bad, well, it just naturally stirs up the appropriate feeling. Like, you can't really understand that you did something wrong and not feel bad about it. Have you ever just known you should do something, even if it was hard, even if you didn't want to?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, Price would say that knowing itself, it kind of pushes you in that direction. It has this weight to it.
That's an interesting idea. But what about when people do bad things, even though they know they shouldn't? I mean, that happens all the time.
Yeah, and Price acknowledges that. He's not naive. He's saying the recognition of moral obligation, it gives you a really strong reason to act, but we humans, we're weak sometimes. We can fail to live up to what we know is right. But he believed that no truly rational being could just completely ignore their moral obligations all the time. If you consistently do the wrong thing, it shows a kind of irrationality. For Price, moral principles, they're not just suggestions, they're principles of practical reason. So there shouldn't be this gap between what morality says you ought to do and what you, like deep down, realize you should do.
Okay, so even if we don't always do the right thing, the idea is that our rational grasp of the odd, that's still what's driving the bus, at least ideally.
Right.
Now, what about those offensive moves against the sentimentalists? How did Price attack their main ideas head on?
All right, so his main target here is this idea of a moral sense. Like we have five senses, right? Sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing. Well, some sentimentalists, they thought there was this extra sense, a moral sense, that's how we make moral judgments. Thinkers like Hutcheson and Hume, they were big on this idea. Bryce thought this was a bad idea. He said if morality is all about this special sense, well, then it's totally dependent on how we humans happen to feel. Like if we had evolved differently, our moral sense would be different. And there would be no way to say which moral sense was better. It'd just be like different strokes for different folks. And Price was worried that this made the foundation for morality shaky, really shaky.
Yeah, it makes it sound like right and wrong is just like up to how you feel, which seems, I don't know, kind of random.
Exactly. It's subjective, right? And that bothered Price a lot. So he pointed to what we call moral phenomenology. That's just a fancy way of saying, what does it feel like to actually make a moral judgment? Price argued that when you think something like gratitude is good, it doesn't feel like you're just having a feeling or a gut reaction. It feels like you're seeing something true about gratitude itself, like you're discovering a fact, not just having an emotion.
Like you're understanding something, not just reacting.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then Price took on this analogy that sentimentalists used a lot. They compared moral qualities to secondary qualities, like color and sound and smell. Philosophers like Locke and Hume, they said these secondary qualities, they're not really in the objects themselves, they're in our minds. It's how our senses experience the world. So like a red apple, it's not really red in the same way that it's really round. Redness is just how our minds interpret certain wavelengths of light.
Right, the whole beauty's in the eye of the beholder thing.
Yeah, that's the idea. But Price argued that this analogy doesn't work for moral properties. He said thinking of secondary qualities as being in the object is just incoherent. It doesn't make sense. He even uses this weird example. He says talking about a colored body is as nonsensical as talking about a square sound. Like those ideas just don't go together.
Why not? The Intermensches' argument was about sensations and conscious beings.
Right, so Price had two key points. First, he said, well, only conscious beings can have sensations like colors, sounds, tastes, smells, all that. And second, he said these secondary qualities, they are those sensations. So it just doesn't make sense to think of them as properties of like a rock or a chair because those things aren't conscious. They don't have sensations. And he used pain as an analogy. If you get stabbed with a knife and it hurts, it would be crazy to say the pain is a property of the knife, right? Pain only exists in a conscious being. And he said it's the same with colors and sounds.
But the entry does point out that this might be a little question begging. Like, a sentimentalist could just say that both moral qualities and secondary qualities are just projections of our minds.
Yeah, that's a fair point that the entry brings up. The sentimentalist could say, look, we talk about objects having color and actions being right, but both of those are really based on how we think and feel. So they're both kind of metaphysical errors, meaning we're ascribing properties to the world that aren't really there. Price's argument here, it does rely on him already disagreeing with the basic sentimentalist idea.
Sounds like a complicated philosophical debate. But what about the idea that secondary qualities are really just like dispositions in the object? Like the redness of the apple is just its disposition to produce the sensation of red in us. Did Price address that?
He did. And the entry suggests he wouldn't have bought that for moral properties either. His big problem with sentimentalism, in all its forms, was that it makes moral truth dependent on human nature. Like, if what we approve of is just a result of how our minds work, then if our minds were different, our morality would be different. And there's no way to say one is better than the other.
And for Price, this was a huge problem. He believed in God.
Yeah.
And if sentimentalism was right, that would mean maybe God doesn't even share our moral sentiments.
But exactly. The entry points out that even Hume himself had said this to Hutcheson. And Price takes it a step further, saying, well, if sentimentalism is true, then God would basically be morally indifferent to everything because he doesn't have our human emotions. So he wouldn't make any moral judgments based on feelings. But Price, he was all about the idea that moral facts are just facts. They're out there, independent of us.
Okay, so that brings us to this idea of necessary moral principles. If morality is objective and comes from reason, did Price think there are these absolute moral rules, the kind that never have any exceptions?
Well, the entry makes a good point. If you think there are these fundamental moral principles, principles that are necessarily true, then it might seem like they have to be exceptionless. Like if lying is wrong, then all lying is wrong no matter what.
Right.
But Price, unlike some other philosophers like Kant, he recognized that this kind of strict moral thinking, it just didn't fit with reality. He knew that moral principles can conflict, and sometimes it's not so simple. The right thing to do, it depends on the situation.
So the basic moral principles might be fixed, but how you apply them in the real world, that can get messy.
Exactly. And he recognized that when different moral principles clash, it's not always clear what the right thing to do is. That's why we have moral debates, even among people who are really trained to do good. But here's the thing. Price still believed that there is one right action in every situation. Even if we, with our limited human brains, don't know what it is, he's saying it's our knowledge that's the problem, not that morality itself is unclear.
Okay, that's an important distinction. And the entry even says that Price was kind of hinting at this idea that W.D. Ross would later call prima facie duties. These are duties that seem right at first glance, but then they can be overridden by other duties in specific situations.
Right, exactly. And Price uses this analogy of forces acting on an object. He's like, just because it's hard to predict exactly where an object will go when lots of forces are pulling on it, that doesn't mean we don't understand how those forces work. And the same goes for moral dilemmas. The fact that they're complicated, that doesn't mean we don't understand the basic moral principles involved.
Okay, that helps to picture it. Now let's move on to Price's concept of virtue. What made an action virtuous for him?
For Price, a truly virtuous act, it's one that's done out of a sense of duty. It's about consciously recognizing what morality requires, what's right and what's wrong, and then acting based on that. He was very firm on this point. He actually said that actions that are done just out of kindness, like you're just naturally a nice person, those actions, well, they don't have real moral worth. He thought the more we act just on impulse and the less we act from a reasoned understanding of our duties, the less virtuous we are.
So doing something nice because you feel like it, that's not enough for Price. You've got to know it's your duty and do it for that reason. That's a pretty high bar.
Yeah, it is. He knew that humans, we have all sorts of motivations, like self-love, desires, emotions, and these often clash with our sense of duty. But he thought we can learn to control those impulses. We can use our will, and we can work on our character to become more rational and thoughtful. And the more we do that, the more our desires and feelings will line up with our moral obligations.
That makes sense. Now, the entry also talks about abstract or objective virtue versus practical or subjective duty. What's the difference?
Oh, that's an important distinction that philosophers like Pritchard and Ross would develop later. Objective duty, that's about what's really morally required in a situation, considering all the facts, even the ones we might not know. But subjective duty, that's about what a person should do based on what they reasonably believe is true. Price thought we should judge people based on whether they fulfilled their subjective duty. I mean, we can't expect people to be perfect. We make mistakes. We don't always know all the facts.
Right. You can't blame someone for making a decision based on what they thought was true, even if it turns out they were wrong. Makes sense. Now, Price is famous for rejecting this idea of supererogation, which is basically doing more than your duty requires. Why was he so against the idea of going above and beyond?
Yeah, that's one of his controversial ideas. Price was very strict in how he divided up actions. For him, there were only three categories. Right, meaning required; wrong, meaning forbidden; and indifferent, meaning it doesn't matter morally. And he said supererogatory acts, they don't fit. They're supposed to be, like, not required, but they're also not morally neutral. We praise people for doing them. So Price came to this strange conclusion. Aiming to do more than your duty is the same as going against your duty, and doing more than is right is like doing wrong.
Whoa, hold on. That sounds kind of crazy. Doing too much good is wrong.
I know, right? It sounds harsh. But he tried to soften it a bit. He said, well, maybe right and obligatory aren't exactly the same thing. So maybe there are actions that are right, but you're not strictly required to do them. But he didn't really like that solution. It messed up his neat three categories. So his preferred solution, it was to say, look, lots of our duties, like being benevolent, they're pretty general. And a really virtuous person, they're always trying hard to meet those general duties. So they end up being really generous, more than what most people would do. But Price says we're not praising them for going above and beyond. We're praising them for being extra careful, for making sure they're really fulfilling those broad duties. He even pointed out that lots of people we think of as heroes or saints, well, they said they were just doing their duty.
That's interesting. So it's not about exceeding the minimum. It's about being super careful not to fall short of the full duty, even if it's a really big general duty. Okay, I can see that. Now, the entry spends some time talking about Price's view on promising, which is another thing that people have debated. He connected promising to veracity, being truthful. Why did he see them as related?
So Price argued that keeping promises, it's all about being truthful, being honest. He made a distinction between talking about the present, like saying what you intend to do right now, and talking about the future, like making a promise, just saying what you intend to do, that doesn't obligate you to anything. But a promise, well, that's different. It's saying something will be done.
Hmm.
So if you promise something, it's not enough to have intended it when you said it. You actually have to do it, otherwise you're going against your word.
So breaking a promise is basically like being dishonest, like lying, but about the future.
Yeah, he saw it as that. Not exactly lying, because lying is about saying something false about the present, but it's about failing to uphold what you said about the future. And he saw that as violating this general duty to be truthful, to be reliable. Now, the entry does mention some problems with this view, like lying usually has a specific time and audience. You lie to someone at a specific moment, but failing to keep a promise, that unfolds over time.
Right, it's not just a one-time thing.
And promises are usually made to a specific person, so you're obligated to that person. Prices focus on veracity in general. Well, it doesn't seem to capture that. Like, if I promise you a ride and then I don't show up, you've got a complaint, other people don't. Promises, they're personal. That goes beyond just making a true statement.
That makes sense. It feels more direct, like you owe something to that person. But the entry does say that Price had a wider view of veracity than just avoiding lying.
Oh, yeah, he did. For him, veracity included being impartial when you're looking for truth, being honest in how you communicate, acting with integrity, being sincere, keeping your commitments, and even avoiding self-deception, like lying to yourself. So you could say that breaking a promise, it does fit under this broader idea of being dishonest, not being trustworthy. The entry suggests that Price might have been trying to deal with this puzzle that Hume brought up. Hume wondered, how can just willing something, like making a promise, how can that suddenly create a new moral obligation?
It's like, how can saying "I promise" make something morally binding that wasn't binding before?
Exactly. And Price agreed with Hume that obligations, they don't just pop out of nowhere. He said when you make a promise, you're basically putting your action under a moral principle that was already there. And in this case, that principle is veracity, honesty, and trustworthiness. It's not your will that changes whether the action is right or wrong. It's that you're choosing to do it under this already existing moral law.
That's a clever way to try to get around Hume's puzzle, by grounding the obligation of promising in something more fundamental. Now, the outline mentions that we should briefly touch on some other areas of Price's thought, just to give a sense of how wide-ranging his mind was, even though our main focus is on his moral philosophy. So the entry mentions his a priori arguments for God's existence.
Yeah, Price actually presented those arguments in a dissertation that he included with his book review of the principal questions in morals. He was inspired by Samuel Clarke, and he starts with a version of the cosmological argument, which basically goes like this. There are things in the world that could have not existed, they're contingent. But if everything was contingent, there'd be nothing to start the chain of existence. So there has to be something that exists necessarily, something that couldn't have not existed. And that, he says, is God.
Okay, so he's saying God is necessary, not just in the sense that everything needs a cause, but that God's very nature is to exist.
Exactly, it's built in. And this ties into his moral philosophy in a really interesting way, because one objection to rejecting the divine command theory, the idea that morality is just whatever God says, is that it seems to make God less powerful, less authoritative. But Price, he turns that around. He says God's moral rightness, it's not about obeying some external set of rules. It's about acting perfectly in line with his own necessary nature, which for Price is eternal truth and reason.
Wow, that's a powerful way to connect the nature of God with the objectivity of morality. Now, the entry also mentions his views on natural theology, which is basically trying to understand God by looking at the world around us. And it talks about his take on miracles, especially how he critiqued Hume's skepticism about miracles.
Right, so in natural theology, Price was much like Cleanthes in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. They both thought you could see evidence of a designer in how intricate and well-ordered the world is. But Price also admitted there's this problem of why good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people.